Good afternoon, and welcome to the Institute for the Fiduciary Standards third event of Fiduciary September, titled Testing CRS, a review of 29 broker-dealer forms. My name is Darren Fogarty, and I am the research analyst at the Institute. Today's event will focus on fresh research from the Institute that examines the broker-dealer and investment advisor Form CRS disclosures. Following a presentation by Knut Rostad, Deborah Bosley will join him for a discussion of the SEC's guidance on CRS. Deborah Bosley is the owner of the Plain Langauge Group. Bosley holds a PhD in rhetoric and writing and is an international expert in plain language in financial services, healthcare, internet, technology, and educational institutions. She has spent the past 20 years working in regulatory environments, helping attorneys, corporations, government agencies, and nonprofits write material that exceeds compliance standards and is easy for people to understand and use. Knut Rostad is the president and founder of the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard. Rostad formerly served as a regulatory and compliance officer at Rembert Pendleton Jackson, an RIA in Northern Virginia. He has authored dozens of articles, papers, and regulatory comment letters, is regularly cited in media, national and industry outlets, and speaks frequently at industry conferences on fiduciary and compliance issues. We will have time for Knut and Deborah to present, and we'll also have time for Q&A. Please submit your questions to the chat. If possible, we'd like to let audience members ask the panelists their questions directly, but still ask that you submit those questions first through the chat feature. Just so everyone knows, there will be a recording of this event on the Institute's website shortly after it concludes, along with the presentation that Knut is going to be giving. And with all that out of the way, I'd like to pass it over to Knut Rostad.
Thank you, Darren. And thank you to everyone who is joining us this afternoon. And first and foremost, I have to wish you a happy Fiduciary September. I know that we are in the midst of our programs right now, as Darren said, and even though we're getting towards the end of the month, we are just sort of in the middle of the programs that we are providing. So what I am going to do this afternoon is review some research that we have just released today regarding our review of CRS forms of both duly registered firms and independent RIAs. So let's start with in the first slide. Excuse me, Darren. Let's start with at the beginning in terms of why do we have Form CRS according to the Securities Exchange Commission. The purpose is quite simple and straightforward. It is to reduce investor confusion. This is something that Chair Jay Clayton emphasized throughout his advocacy for the rulemaking, and specifically in June of 2019, he named it as two of the three main reasons for the rulemaking. Additionally, in the CRS release itself, we see that it is stated that reducing retail investor confusion in the marketplace for as investors look for brokerage investment advisory service is the reason for it. I want to add at this point a question that I've gotten a number of times, and that is, why is the Institute focused so much on disclosure and this disclosure? And this is a good question because disclosure as a tactic, as a tool, has a very sorry record in terms of what we know what we know about its success and effectiveness for retail investors. The libraries of studies and experience make clear that so much of the disclosure we see is either ineffective or in fact can be harmful. So this is a good question, and the answer to that question from the point of view of the Institute, quite frankly, is that the disclosure that we see right now from the CRS forms that have been out for over a year are so terribly deficient that they can be improved, A, and B, that in this regard, the opportunities here for CRS, given the space limitations and the parameters, are, in our view, excellent in terms of actually serving a consumer's purpose the way it is intended to. So I want to make that point up front because I think it's a good point to be made in the context of the general record of disclosures over the years. So as when we look at the next slide, the question is, what are we looking for in these forms? And as we thought about it, the two points came up. One is what information in these forms is material information, i.e. that's an important legal definition that drives much of disclosure in securities. And then the other piece of this was what is it about the core purposes and roles based on the law and function of broker-dealers and investment advisors that is being disclosed, that really tells investors something important. So this boils down to the nature of their role and purpose and the types of compensation that are being used, using as much as possible objective criteria. So in this respect, or from this perspective, we looked at 29 large dual registrants and 12 fee-only independent RIA forms. So this is where we're starting. And in terms of what we found, here we break it down by the type of form that we're looking at. And the first one is the investment advisor forms of dual registrants. And as we looked at the investment advisor forms, we basically focused on one objectively determined piece of information or criteria, and that is, how is the fiduciary status of the investment advisor handled? So when we look at the 29 forms, we find that 17 of them make no reference of fiduciary status at all, and only one of the 11 firms that mention fiduciary status also suggest that fiduciary is in fact a higher standard. And this firm, by the way, is Equitable Advisors, and they stand out in this respect. So when we look at these forms for this particular information, the question arises, does the SEC consider fiduciary status to be material? And I think that's a good question that we need to continue looking at as we go forward. And so in the next slide, what we see is we're looking at the independent fee-only investment advisor forms. And again, we looked at 12 larger firms that we got from the Investment News list of investment advisor fee-only firms. And here's what we find, that 5 of the 12 firms make no mention of fiduciary status at all. And when we look at the 7 that do mention fiduciary status, just 2 of the firms clearly describe fiduciary as a better standard for investors. So just looking at this sample of investment advisor firms from the larger ones, and as I think noted on the paper, that in their size, they're all between 5 billion and 30 billion in size. So in the advisor world, registered investment advisor world, these are clearly larger firms. So after this, then we looked at the forms of broker-dealer CR of the broker-dealer forms, and first we looked at what is not being disclosed, i.e., again, going back to the role and purpose of the broker-dealer, what attributes are not being disclosed. And so one point we observe is that there's no broker-dealer CRS states it is prohibited by law from being paid for their recommendations. Not one states that. And in primary offerings for third parties, it is only compensated if a sale is made. Again, that's a piece of information, a factoid that is also not mentioned in any of these forms. And then after that, we also look at the legal relationship between the broker dealers and the issuers or third parties. And what we find is not a single broker-dealer CRS states it acts as an agent for issuers and owes a duty of loyalty and care to these issuers. And also at the same time that not one says that trading and distributing products for third parties are core businesses. So those are two factoids that we pulled together to say that not a single one of the 29 broker-dealer CRS forms mention these facts. And so when we stand back and we look at these sort of four aspects, and then I think we're forced to ask the question is, are these material facts? Are these facts that the average investor would like to know about regarding the firm that they're looking at hiring to help them with their investments? So that's the first part of what we've looked at in terms of the broker-dealer CRS forms, and then we looked at in terms of going further that not a single broker-dealer CRS states that their role as a securities distributor actually conflicts directly with their investment advisor role as a fiduciary advisor. And you could say from the point of view of the broker-dealer, well, of course they're not going to say that, and that's understandable. But then the question should be raised whether they should have to say that, because that is the nature of the difference between an investment advisor and broker-dealer. And so that's in our view what this observation raises. And then in terms of the disclosure of fees, and just on Monday we had a session on fee disclosure and why it is that, or how it is that investors still don't understand their fees. And one of the observations that was made there, and I made it as well, is that there should be no mystery whatsoever why investors don't understand the fees they're paid. And the reason why there should be no mystery is because they're not told. And this is obvious when you look at what is required of both broker-dealers and investment advisors, and look at their CRS forms. So we, as we state here, no broker-dealer CRS states the firm discloses fee schedules because disclosure of actual fees is not required by the SEC. And you can say, well, of course, a firm is not going to say that. And in a sense, that's understandable. But in the context of this great wrestling, this great anguish about why investors don't understand their fees, I think it should be looked at a bit differently, and that we should raise the standard, frankly, for what we expect the disclosure to be regarding fees. And so even though the SEC does not require the disclosure of fees, what we also see, and this is seen in the release, I should say the CRS release, is that the SEC does acknowledge that the broker dealers are, quote, well positioned to provide individualized fee information. And I think this is an important point because elsewhere the SEC argues that it would be burdensome and difficult to do this. So we're hearing both these arguments here, but I think the bottom line in terms of disclosure, in terms of what is not included in the CRS form, it is the answer to the simple question, what is this going to cost me? And so when we look at these observations here, we do ask the question, are these considered material facts? And then so as we sort of look at these forms, again from a high level, three basic conclusions come to mind, and that is that the CRS forms do not disclose material information on their roles and purposes and compensation based in law and function of both investment advisors and broker dealers. That's our first conclusion. The second conclusion is that the degree to which the compensation methods for broker dealers and investment advisors those differences are extraordinarily diminished. And what that means quite specifically is the separate tasks of selling products for third-party commissions on the one hand, and advising clients for client fees are portrayed to be very much alike. They are discussed in the same context. They are not differentiated as a rule of thumb at all. Although there are a couple of exceptions to that. And so fees and commissions are basically treated pretty much alike. And then thirdly, in terms of what we find on the forms themselves, emphasizes the appearance of similarities. And what we mean by that is when you look at the required language on standards, on obligations, on conflicts, that required language is identical for investment advisors and broker dealers. And when we come to the framing of the services, products, and fees as defining attributes, basically make broker dealers and investment advisors appear to be very similar. And so based on looking at these forms, there should be no surprise, no mystery why they do not do a very good job at all in informing investors how broker dealers and investment advisors differ, and that because by what they put out there, they absolutely stress the similarities. And then very specifically, I think we should also take note of how the issue of fiduciary status is treated in these forms relative to other points. And the majority of investment advisor forms that were reviewed make no mention whatsoever of fiduciary status, while at the same token, the required language from the SEC includes conversation starters. And I think that contrast between what is required as opposed to what is not required speaks a great deal about where the SEC appears to be regarding how broker dealers and investment advisors are in 2021 and how they should be thought of in 2021. So on that, I will stop and hand the microphone over to Deborah.
Thank you, Knut, and thank you all for joining us today. So, excuse me, of the 29 documents that the Institute analyzed, I picked 6 at random, 6 to go into a deep dive on the language that they're using. Knut quite well discussed the content, what was in, what was left out, etc. So I'm going to now take a look at it from the point of view of plain language, meeting the requirement for plain language, and how well or how poorly the 6 that I analyzed did. I will state that I have not completed my analysis, but I'm going to tell you up until this point what some of the issues are. So there is a lot of lack of understanding, a lack of ease of understanding. So let me go through just kind of the overriding issues. Number one, there's too much information crammed on each page. I recognize that there was a limit of 2 pages and or 4 pages depending upon the type of firm. That said, there is a lot of information that has been crammed on each page. And if you think about yourself just as a reader, if someone hands you even 2 pages that seems full of text everywhere, the likelihood of your reading it is probably relatively small, even when it's information that you should be reading. So that visual appeal of breathing space and white space and ways for your eyes to just ease between chunks of information is not particularly well done on the 6 that I looked at. Again, and this has to do with how much information they're trying to cram on each page. The typeface is small. In fact, one of the 6 that I had looked at was using 8-point type. And in every regulation I've seen that requires the use of plain language, 10 is the minimum. And frankly, from the standpoint of older investors, even 10-point type is small, but 8 certainly is difficult to read. There is a lack of examples. For example, when Knut was talking about fees and the inability of the fees not even being discussed in a numeric way, there are no examples. So it would have been very helpful had there been an example on the IA side and the BD side of just, a hypothetical account of X amount of money, and then what the relationship would be of those assets to the fees that the investor has to pay. So examples are really important, particularly in situations in which, as many documents have said, that people are not financially literate. Well, in fact, they're often not financially literate because they're getting information in a manner that does not make it easy for them to understand it. Also, thick paragraphs. In the plain language world, we recommend no more than 3 sentences per paragraph so that you have that white space, so that your mind can absorb the information and move it from short-term to long-term memory so that you can actually remember what you read. Long sentences, we recommend sentences be no longer than, say, 15 to 20 words. On some of these 6 that I looked at, there were sentences that moved into the 30s. And again, long sentences create information overload on readers. The use of the passive voice. So in many instances, rather than stating up front who is responsible for what, that information in a passive construction is put at the end or left out entirely. So in plain language standards, best practices, much of which came from the 1998 SEC handbook on plain English itself, it is recommended that sentences be shorter and that we use the active voice, which is much easier for people to read, understand, and remember. And then finally, financial jargon. So although some of the 6 did a relatively good job of trying to eliminate jargon and or define it, there was still a multitude of examples of financial jargon like discretionary investment authorization or investment authority. And that language was used without an explanation of what it meant. So, excuse me. So we have issues of long paragraphs and long sentences, still using financial jargon that the average investor is not likely to understand, the use of the passive voice, which makes remembering the information more difficult, too much information crammed on each page, and an issue of the typeface that is being used in terms of its size and whether or not the size alone is going to encourage people to read or repel them from reading. So that's my overall assessment of the 6, and I will be forwarding to Knut a table that compares all 6 with explanations of where the problems are within each of the 6 that I've done a longer analysis of. So those are my comments on the 6 that we chose, or excuse me, randomly chose.
Thank you, Deborah. Darren, do we have any questions?
Not yet, although we invite you audience members to submit questions, either of Deborah or Knut, based on the information you just heard. And if you have one, we will give you the opportunity to ask them directly. Okay, have one from Javier. He says, when does the paper plan to be released?
The paper, I should say, was released at 3 o'clock per the embargo placed on the top of it. That was distributed yesterday and the day before.
Great.
So
and we'll have the website shortly after the presentation.
Exactly.
Are there any other questions? So I think Mark has his hand raised, but I'm not sure if he has a question or not. I guess I will send him an invitation to unmute himself if you'd like.
Wait, may I ask it, or do I have to put it in the chat?
Yeah, go ahead and ask it. We can all hear you.
You're on, Mark.
Yeah, Knut, I thought that, and maybe my memory is fuzzy. Maybe it was in the Reg BI proposal and not the final, the Form CRS proposal and not the final. But at some point there was a prohibition on using the word fiduciary in Form CRS, right?
Well, that's a really good point, Mark. And I don't believe that is correct, because in the process here, I did reach out to a number of securities attorneys and consultants, and here's what I have learned. When the form did come out, there was a question about this, and I think it was Investment Advisor Association who clarified the question to say that it was okay to use the word fiduciary. And that, so, and that was June of 2 years ago. Now, what I've also heard, and maybe this rings a bell to you, Mark, because you cover these things so closely. Last December, in a webinar from the SEC, I am told that there was a question regarding or a point made by the SEC staff regarding changing the required language. And the SEC understandably said, no, you can't change the required language. And what I am told, again, by, in fact, a staffer at the Investment Advisor Association, is that to some people that was misinterpreted to mean that you could not use the term fiduciary. But so those are two pieces that I've identified. In addition to that, based on conversations with 3 different compliance consultants, it's absolutely okay to use the word fiduciary. But in terms of explaining why it's not used as often as we might want or expect, I also spoke with several executives from these firms, and to a person, they were not aware of the fact that their own CRS did not use this word, and they intend to make changes forthwith. And then I also did see some degree of their firm's staff members not recommending that the term be used. So, Mark, that's what I have found out in my travels.
Okay, so it's safe to say there's confusion though out there about whether fiduciary can be used in Form CRS.
Yes,
because I mean, sort of the thrust of all of this from the SEC was to sort of bring the oversight of brokers and investment advisors closer together, and so that's why there was the sensitivity about the use of the word fiduciary, right?
I think that would be a very fair explanation. And you know, you just have to look at the required language regarding the standard. And so yes, that is exactly what they're trying to do. And so yes, I think you're correct that there's a fair amount of misunderstanding on this point. You know, there may also be an undertow of a misinterpretation, as maybe you're implying there, Mark, that the SEC is indirectly discouraging the use of fiduciary by the required language that they have put out there.
Well, far be it from me to put words in the SEC's mouth. But
No. I know you would never do such a thing. Would never do such a thing.
But I mean, but it's clear from anyone who observed the whole Reg BI process, the goal of the Clayton SEC was to bring oversight of brokers and advisors closer together. So in the words of Chairman Clayton, former Chairman Clayton, paraphrasing him, whether investors go to a broker or an advisor, they're going to sort of get the same thing. I mean, that was his whole thrust.
Well, I think in part. Now, here's where, you know, and I think for anyone that's followed this closely, you know, over a couple of years period, that there are some expressions or statements that might appear not to be consistent with others. And on that point, in fact, in his statement in June 2019, one of the points that Chairman Clayton makes, frankly, is the fact that broker dealers and investment advisors do different things. Now, he doesn't define that in that context, but he certainly acknowledges it. And so you know, my reading on that was that in parts, and you know, in part, the point was to point out the different things that broker dealers and investment advisors do. So, but you know, but yes, you're correct that there's other language out there that that is clearly suggests that the apparent similarities or the similarities in the view of the SEC are far more important than the differences between broker dealers and investment advisors.
All right, thank you, Mark. I think Tracy might have a question. Tracy, I'm going to unmute you here so you can ask it directly. If you don't have one, that's okay. Just tell us. You're unmuted.
Hi there. Thank you for hosting us, Knut and Deborah. I had a quick question. Have you made your findings available to the SEC yet and gotten any regulator feedback?
And no, we haven't, because we literally have just released it. But immediately following this webinar, we will start sending the findings along. But you know, related to that, Tracy, but a question that you did not ask, and I'll just say that, you know, in July and August we had 4 meetings at the SEC. 3 with commissioners and 4 with investor advocate, and in each and every case there was levels of interest in taking another look at Form CRS, and along that line additional data regarding testing. So along that line, this is what we have tried to do. And so we'll follow up forthwith with the SEC commissioners and the investor advocate.
Did you, just as a quick follow-up, did you also hear in these 4 meetings that there was interest in disclosing actual client costs, charges, compensation that was paid, fees, etc., or you know, however it might be configured?
Well, that topic, yes, we did raise that topic. In fact, we have a proposed point of sale service cost disclosure document, a 2-page prototype that in fact is based on Morningstar's work, and Morningstar has also proposed, and so there is some level of interest there. But you know, I won't say that it's as much as the interest from looking at CRS form. I think that's because it's fresher. But I will say, as also as an addendum to your question, Tracy, that you know, when we met with the commissioners in 2018 and early 2019, and I can't tell you exactly which date it was, but we we did get interest specifically from Commissioner Peirce on the issue of individualized fee disclosure, and of course she mentioned that, I think, in her comments in April 2018. So she certainly has that on her radar screen.
Thank you.
Darren, you're.
Yeah, I saw. I'm busy unmuting people. So we have one more question from David Brandoff. Thank you, Tracy. He says, when firms use the term fiduciary, what are they saying about this term? And I will unmute him so that he can ask any other follow-up questions to that as you respond.
Okay. As reported in our paper, most of the firms that use this term did not try to define it beyond linking it to the language that the SEC requires regarding the standard of care for broker-dealers and investment advisors. And as I point out in the paper, the language that is used to describe broker-dealers and investment advisors that is required actually is a demotion for fiduciary, because that language specifically speaks to the requirement that the broker-dealer not put the firm's interest ahead of the customer's. Now, it sounds similar to the traditional language for fiduciary, but it's not. It is actually quite different. And unfortunately, I don't think this has been pointed out enough. And what I mean by this is that according to this standard, it's okay to place the interest of the broker-dealer equal to, alongside, or in the same footing of the customer. Which, in fact, I think there's language going back in the history of broker-dealers that this similar type of language. Now, that's a very different standard than the traditional fiduciary standard that clearly says that the interest of the client must come first. So the other part of that question, the answer to that question from David, is that that's how some of the IAs try to describe what it meant to be a fiduciary, but the vast majority, or I should say, it's only the small minority, and I think of the 29 plus the 12, only 3 of those firms actually used independent language that suggested that the fiduciary standard was better or higher than the broker-dealer standard. So that's what we see. David, did you have any more to add?
He didn't unmute himself, but that's okay. I think he probably got his answer there. So I guess we'll just give everyone one last chance to put a question in the chat to have it answered. If not, we'll probably be inclined to wrap things up.
Let me ask a question of Deborah regarding what you have seen that we have done in terms of looking at the dual registrants and the independent RIAs, and whether you see on the face of it any association between what we have concluded in terms of looking at the content in comparison to what you have concluded in terms of looking at the presentation, the how the information is organized, how the language is written, beyond, I guess beyond what you've already said.
Well, I think the two go hand in hand. I think you have confusion on both sides. You have confusion of what the content is or is supposed to be, what language you're supposed to use or not use, all of your material facts that you presented earlier go hand in hand with the problem of how the information is presented. So I would say that we have problems on both sides, confusion, and then there's also confusion in terms of the presentation of the information itself as well. So for example, if I were to test this on your ordinary investor, I'm not sure they could really tell me what fiduciary means beyond in my best interest for me, the customer, which may in fact actually just be the right definition for fiduciary. But the way the information is explained, not only because of the language it's using, but because of the inconsistencies that you pointed out earlier, the two together, sort of create a hurricane of information that is not easy for, I would venture to say, the average investor to understand. So I think the two go hand in hand.
Thank you. Anyone else there, Darren?
Yeah, there's one last question. It's for you, Knut. And I want to be respectful of Deborah's time. I know she's got to leave in a few minutes. I'll unmute Tracy so she can ask it directly, but it asks about enforcement. Go ahead,
Hi
Tracy.
there. Thank you. Hey, Knut, I know you're a former compliance guy, so do you think some of these omissions rise to the level of a possible enforcement, or that they'll be, handled as a teachable moment, so to speak, by the SEC and examiners?
Well, Tracy, that's a really good question. And, I have not heard the counter argument, the other side of the argument that says the basic functions, purposes, and roles of a broker dealer are not material information. They're not. Now, I think someone would have to make that argument. It would have to make that case, Tracy, that those attributes that we pointed out are not material. And frankly, I don't know how they could be argued to be not material, considering they essentially define what it is that a broker dealer does. So that's how I look at it. And I think the important point is that we're not talking about characteristics and features sort of at the edges. We're talking about the very essence of what it does, of what a broker dealer does. And so I don't know how they could argue the other point, but far be it for me to underestimate the power of the legal profession in terms of arguing all sorts of points, shall we say. So there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you.
May I add one thing to that too? I think this issue of consequences is really critical, because even if you look only at the consequences of did they or do these forms or do these forms not meet the standard of plain language, which is part of what the regulation requires, what are the consequences to the firms for not just meeting that standard? Even if they do or do not meet the content standard, they are not meeting the standard of what it means to use plain language. And I would be very interested in knowing what are or are there any consequences for that part of the situation, not just the content itself.
Thank you, Deborah.
All right.
Darren?
Those are all the questions.
Great. So you want to
Thank you all.
Yeah,
For being-
thank everyone for coming.
thank you everyone for coming. We'll have this up on the website forthwith. And of course, for follow-up questions, I think most of you know where to find me via email or cell phone. So thank you very much for joining, and happy Fiduciary September.